Welcome to the Triage Method podcast with me, Gary McGowan, and my co-host, Mr. Patrick Farrell. How are you this week, Paddy? We missed you last week when Brian was on.
Yes, I am positively fantastic, and now my eyes work. They are better than 2020 vision. I can literally see everything. That is when they're not dry, because they are now prone to getting a little bit more dry, but that's only natural after I got my fucking cornea dissolved or whatever the fuck they were doing to me anyway. And then shot lasers into it, which is actually pretty cool because like I was thinking of it, this is completely nerdy tangent, but I was thinking about it. I was like doing during getting the laser, I was like, I smell burning, but then I was like, no, it doesn't really smell like burning. And I was trying to think of like what the smell was, and then I was like, oh, it actually smells like ozone, because it's actually the laser was going through the air, which was interacting like with the air itself, creating ozone. But anyway, if you're ever wondering, you got laser eye surgery and you're like, oh, I smell burning, I was like, I'm pretty sure it was ozone, right? But anyway, that's a completely side tangent to what we actually want to discuss. But before we get into that, Gary, how are you? Are you phenomenal as well?
I'm grand, as we say in Ireland, in response to all how are yous. So yeah, I'm grand. I wouldn't say I'm fantastic, but I'm grand. We're on the path.
Getting the job done, ticking the boxes.
Yes, sir. And this week, what we are going to discuss is health. Okay, we're going to discuss health. We're going to kind of focus on obesity because it's what we've been discussing over the last number of weeks, if not months at this point. And we're going to talk about health and the difference between the population and the individual, because this is a really, really important topic that's often missed in the health and fitness sphere. Because when we think about the types of content that we consume online, if we're personal trainers or if we're trainees looking to improve our body composition, for example, it's very much content that is intended to be delivered to an individual end user. Okay, so it might be something like, here's how to track your calories, and here's the specific multipliers you use, and all these sorts of things. And then what you do is, when you encounter certain problems, you troubleshoot those problems by seeking out content related to that specific problem you're having as an individual. And as a result of that, what we end up doing is we end up on an iterative process where we encounter those problems, create solutions, and we end up with our own individual way of eating, diet pattern, training program, etc. So my diet pattern might be different to Paddy's, might be different to Brian's, might be different to our clients, despite the fact that we would all agree on the basic nutrition principles. So there's still some divergence while adhering to those nutrition principles. But even when we acknowledge nutrition principles, we recognize that there are different ways of approaching things. So for example, we might put calorie intake pretty high in the order of priority. We might say that we want people to eat lots of fruits and vegetables and fiber, but we might then say, the specific quantity of fat or carbohydrate that you consume is not necessarily that important. Okay, there's certain subcomponents of that, like the fiber as a component of carbohydrate intake, and saturated fat and unsaturated fat as components of fat intake, that are important. But there's certainly room for many different diet patterns to be classified as healthful. Okay, and for that reason, this ends up being something that people can't quite put together when looking at population health recommendations. And the way in which this often manifests is that people will look at the dietary guidelines, for example, whether they be from the HSE in Ireland, the NHS or Public Health England in the UK, the dietary guidelines for Americans in the US. They're all very similar concepts, because when we think about population health, the goal of public policy, from a guidelines perspective, not necessarily looking at regulation of food yet, but just the guidelines, the goal is to look at what the evidence is most in favor of as a broad principle. So for example, eating more fruits and vegetables is something that is almost always recommended in all guidelines, because that's beneficial for the vast majority of people. However, if you're an individual with IBS, for example, you might actually find that eating lots of certain vegetables gives you lots of gas and discomfort and bloating, which might necessarily feel like it's improving your personal health and well-being. So this is where we start to see this sort of divergence at times on the individual level from the population health recommendations, because we're actually looking at different goals. And we've decided to conceptualize this in the way that many do, as kind of like a bell curve. Because what we're trying to do with population health recommendations, whether they be guidelines or interventions in the form of regulation of the food supply, is shift the bell curve in the direction of better health. And an example of this would be, for example, public health guidelines to reduce salt intake, as well as the regulation of salt intake within the food supply. For example, if all the soups and the crisps and the bread products, etc., if all of those products have less sodium in them as a result of regulation, for example, the result of that would be an average decline in population blood pressure. That blood pressure might not reduce in every single individual. And you may even have some cases where an individual might be consuming too little salt for their health or for their performance. But on average across the population, what you would see is that population blood pressure would move in that direction of lower blood pressure, which would then reduce things like rates of stroke, myocardial infarction, heart failure, etc. Okay, so that's an example of where that kind of population level thinking begins to move the bell curve, despite the fact that it may not necessarily be 100% the best advice for every individual. So this is what we want you guys to start thinking about when you're thinking about public health recommendations, because very often when you're thinking about that high level of analysis from the population level, it's actually really difficult to give guidelines that have sufficient granularity to suit every single individual. And that's why if someone signs up with us, for example, we're going to work on trying to build a diet with you that actually suits your needs, suits your preferences, suits your responses to different foods, etc., and suits your baseline health status. At the population level, you can't be certain of everyone's baseline health status. You can't be certain of everyone's preferences. So as a result, the guidelines have to be a little bit vague in order to actually make sense for the most amount of people. And that also goes then for regulation of the food supply. Because if we were to take that example of salt, some athletes might actually want a food product that is higher in salt after a competition, for example. Or if you think about the regulation of sugar per 100 mils, let's say, in a soft drink, an athlete, for example, a marathon runner, they might actually seek out the highest sugar content and might be limited in their choices as a result of that regulation. But for the vast majority of people, we would expect that would generally be a healthful outcome. So that's an introduction to why this kind of population versus individual level thinking requires a bit of thought and isn't as simple as what can often be the case when we try to advise individuals.
Yeah, like a lot of the stuff we've been talking about in this obesity series, like this stuff, it kind of does transcend what we're talking about, like the health and nutrition stuff, whatever you want to call this stuff. It does transcend it, because effectively we're getting to an issue that has kind of plagued mankind throughout our entirety of living in civilizations, I suppose, and that is, like, we'll call it rugged individualism, or we'll call it like what's good for the individual versus what's good for the society, and those two things, they might not actually align, right? And you can put this in many different categories. Like a one that's obviously present on a lot of people's minds because it's talked about in the media a lot is like money, right? Like you're like, oh well, why should there be billionaires, right? And like they just shouldn't exist, right? And this is an individual perspective where they're like, the individual is the billionaire and they're just doing whatever they can do to maximize their return, right? But on a society level, like the population level, that might not be the best thing for the overall population, for one individual to have billions, right? Now, it's a little bit different in terms of money because, like, as 2020 definitely showed, like money is not finite. So it's not finite like health, or it's not finite like, time or your life or whatever, and like it's basically infinite the way modern monetary policy is, and especially with the fiscal policy of nations that printed money, but so it's not an exact example or an exact transferable example. However, it is something to think about in terms of your everyday life, as well as what we're talking about here with this obesity stuff, and obviously all this health stuff. Because we look at that bell curve now, again, like when we're talking about a bell curve, like it's called a bell curve because it looks like, we'll call it an old-fashioned bell. Like if you think of like the Liberty Bell in America, it's like the tails, the bottom of it, are kind of like going up, and then it goes into this big circle type thing at the top, this curved thing at the top. So obviously if you're not watching the video of this, like I just did the movement with my hands, but most of you have seen the Liberty Bell, especially it's an iconic bell, but you've seen a bell in a bell tower before, like in churches, cathedrals, that kind of stuff, right? So you've seen that, right? And what people tend to focus on when they discuss this stuff are the tail ends, right? The tail ends of that bell curve. They're like, oh, these individuals at the very bottom of this range, this small proportion, it's like top 10% or this bottom 10%. But they completely forget that, oh, it's actually 80% we're here in the middle, the bulk of this bell curve, right? And what we ideally want to do when we're talking about a societal change is move, like if for whatever intervention it is, let's say we have a graph, bottom axis, and then there's not the y-axis, but there's just a straight line going up. And that straight line is whatever metric it is. On the left of the line, it's ill health. On the right of the line, it's good health, right? If we have a bell curve and that line that's going up is bang on in the middle of the bell, it's like going straight through the bell curve, that means that 50% of the population are in a bad position, right? They're either in the ill health mark or they're in the positive health mark, the good health mark, whatever metric we want to say this is, heart disease, fucking lung cancer, or whatever, right? It's just, this is the metric we're going. Ideally, if we're looking at a population level, like we want to move that entire bell so that the majority, we actually want to get the entire bell. Like again, we're thinking of this like Liberty Bell in America, like we want to pick up that bell and move it 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, whatever, centimeters, inches, whatever metric again we're using for our graph, we want to move it across so that the majority of people now are in the good health bracket, whatever metric we're using, right? That's what we want, right? So we want to get the majority. However, like you can imagine that this is not, first of all, an easy thing to get right. Like we're moving something like that's the population. So there's, in Ireland, there's millions, but if you look at like the US, if you look at like China, if you look like wherever it has like a huge population, obviously it gets a little bit harder. But what people tend to focus on are the individuals then that make up that population graph, that bell curve. And while certain individuals might get left behind by moving that bell curve, ultimately it does society better, because more people are now healthier. And if you even think of this from like an individualistic perspective, like if we get the population healthier, like you actually get to keep more of your money because less people are using like healthcare services, less people are dying. We now get better innovation. We now get, better products, services, etc., because people are now healthier. People are now, more successful. They're able to innovate because, they didn't die from fucking a preventable, non-communicable disease. So like society overall is better, not just because the individuals are healthier, but because the society overall is healthier. So even though some individuals in that bell curve might get left behind, and like Gary said, like an easy one is like, obviously we're in this health and fitness world. So easy ones we can point out are, athletes. But we already know if we're looking at this bell curve of the population, like they're down at the tail end here. They're in this like 1 to 2% maybe of the population. So like who really cares on a population level if, oh, fucking Mo Farah can't find a drink to, get some carbohydrates and some electrolytes in after his marathon. Like nobody really cares about that except for Mo Farah, right? So it's like, it kind of misses the point when we do individualize it when we're looking at a population level. However, obviously, and we've talked about this before, like we're coaches, we coach individuals. That's what we do. We also coach other coaches to help other individuals. Like we're not coaching people that are making policy. We're not coaching people that are, writing the laws of the land. So we're obviously going to focus more on what the individual can do, because that's who we work with and that's where we can impact the most change in people's lives. However, understand that that isn't necessarily moving the bell curve, which is the overall goal. And obviously we're talking about this obesity stuff, like the overall goal is to move the population into a non-obese category, you know? So there's fewer and fewer people, like the tail end is the obese end, rather than what's happening currently in the environment we have. And again, if you want to understand the environment a bit more, go back and listen to like the episodes we did on like neoliberalism and stuff. The current environment is one that's shifting the bell curve slowly towards the overweight and obese category. So they're getting more and more people in that bell, like the middle part of that bell. More of them are being shifted into that overweight and obese category, right? So we'll imagine, again, it's a left-right thing. Left is the, you know, underweight, and right is the overweight obese. Like the bell curve is currently shifting more and more towards that overweight and obese mark, rather than moving it down. But obviously, again, if we think about it on a society level, if we do somehow reverse that trend and start moving it down, that does mean that more and more individuals are probably going to fall into that underweight category, even though at the moment it's the very tail end. If we do, you know, bring it down, like more people will be in that tail end. However, that's probably a better issue to deal with than the one that we're currently in. And again, it comes in rings and roads, like it goes in roundabouts almost, where this is the issue that these are the issues that humans have been facing throughout humanity. Like it's something that's just hard to solve, how to get everyone prosperous. Like people are always going to get left behind. And I'll give two examples for this. The first one is during like the lockdowns, like that we've had, rolling lockdowns. Like Ireland has had some of the most restrictive lockdowns in the world because, well, we fucking mangled the job of doing lockdowns. Like we just basically kept our borders open, except for if you're in the country, which makes no sense. But like we've had one of the most restrictive lockdowns throughout the whole thing. And you'll see that some people are thriving during that situation. They're like, look, it's no factor. I get my work done. I still fucking do my training. I just bought some equipment, put it out the back, do whatever. Right? Like some people are doing better than they ever have. Like you look at the amount of people, like you can go on Instagram, you can do whatever, TikTok, wherever, social media, and you'll see people that are like, I use this time to really get ahead. I've lost 100 pounds. I've lost whatever, you know, they've completely transformed their health because they've now had a break from whatever else that was holding them back. And they're in a different situation, different environment. They're able to get it done. Right? So that's something, the environment has shifted and it's changed, and now it's prioritizing these other individuals, right? And again, you can look at the economy with this. Obviously, internet-based companies have just fucking exploded in terms of, you know, the profits they can generate. Like Amazon just hit a new fucking record. I think it was 124 billion they made, billion. Like that's unheard of growth. Like before that, they were just struggling to get over the 100 billion, you know? So it's like, obviously certain companies are getting way better as a result of the environment we now find ourselves in, right? And that's the same with this population bell curve that we're looking at, where again, if we shift it across, like some things are going to do better, some things are going to do worse, but there's no way that we can fix the problem for everyone. And that's where an individual intervention comes in. And then the final one I just wanted to say on that is, like, you've seen this as well in schools. Like this happens in schools as well, where people will effectively ruin the education of children because they try to focus on, you know, the F student in the class, where it's like, oh, we have to bring the F student up to a C because we want them to do well. But all of a sudden now all the A students and the B students and even the C students are like, I don't really get anything from this class, so I'm just not going to try, I'm just not going to bother. So we currently, that's what we're doing with health. We're focusing on the F student, you know, we're basically dragging everyone towards that F student, which is this like overweight, obese category in the context of what we're talking about, when in reality, like what we should be doing is focusing on getting people towards that A student, which, you know, it's a different perspective than the one that we currently have. But I think it's one that people can kind of get their heads around, because you've probably been in a classroom yourself, you know, where it's like someone is in the class that, you know, maybe they're just falling behind, they're not willing to put in the work, they're doing whatever, and all of a sudden it's like now the whole class is being held up, your education is being impacted, and we're in a bad position overall, right? So again, people understand that perspective now. Again, the intervention to fix that isn't completely analogous in terms of how we fix it. Like, I'm not saying we just, oh, the F student, we just leave them behind, you know? Like, obviously I'm not saying that. I'm just using that as an analogy to better understand this bell curve. Because again, if you just presume, the majority of people will say are C students, you know, like C, it's distinctly average. Like, it's not phenomenal, but it's not bad, you know? Like, that's where most people would stay, right? That's where they would fall, right? And obviously we have the tail end where loads of A students, and then or very few A students, and then the other tail end, very few, like, you know, fail, no grade, E students, whatever, you know? But the goal should always be to move the bell curve towards the top. So we have, you know, a few more B students, and if we get a few more A's into there, happy days. But basically we want to move, rather than having the average or the mean at the C point, we want to move it ever so towards the B point. But what can often happen, especially if there are, you know, enough individuals in the F category that are in the class, what can happen is that bell curve can slowly start moving the opposite direction and everyone gets dragged down. So we want to structure society, we want to structure policy so that we can move that bell curve towards the better position. And again, it comes back to that thing where humanity has been struggling with this forever. What's good for the individual isn't necessarily good for society, because in the school example, like, maybe you do just focus on the top 3 students and just really pitch everything at their level and go, yeah, okay, cool, we're only going to focus on you, so we're only going to focus and prioritize you guys, right? That would be like the individual stuff. That's not good for the society then, because the rest of the class just falls behind, because even the B students are struggling to keep up with the A student. Maybe there's 1 or 2 that it's like, oh, like, yeah, I'm just on the edge here, I can keep up, you know? But the majority of the class falls behind then, right? And the opposite thing is, do we just focus on the class and we're only as fast as our lowest or our slowest member, and then all of a sudden the entire class is doing worse, you know? So like, this is something that society has struggled with throughout fucking society, you know? So like, obviously we're not going to fix it or solve this on the podcast, but it is something that you should be thinking about when we are talking about, you know, public health interventions and individual level interventions.
Yeah, and when it comes to obesity itself, then you can think about the types of interventions that might be relevant to this discussion in 2 different ways. So the first would be the interventions that actually directly reduce rates of obesity or overweight, as basically in line with reducing calories or increasing activity, for example. Or you can also look at looking at obesity-related diseases, and even without addressing the obesity, potentially reducing incidence of those diseases. So examples of that would be, if you're trying to reduce cardiovascular disease, you recognize that that's going to be high in an obese population, but that can actually be reduced without just reducing the obesity. And examples of that would be things like saturated fat content in the diet, salt in the food supply, fiber intake, all those sorts of things. Even things like screening for blood pressure, you know, the guidelines related to the administration of cholesterol lowering drugs, blood pressure drugs, etc. All those types of things can move that bell curve of obesity related diseases without necessarily addressing the obesity or adiposity itself. Okay.
Just to interrupt you, just to say that the cholesterol one is actually probably the easiest example with the saturated fat stuff and its interaction with, you know, cholesterol levels. Because and what I mean is, it's a great example because you can see where there starts becoming this friction and this disconnect between, you know, a population recommendation, which is like, you know, eat less saturated fat, and then individuals' experience where they go, I literally eat 50 grams of butter every fucking single day and my blood cholesterol is phenomenal. It's grand, you know? Like, you can see why there becomes a friction then, and people start thinking, they're like, maybe the government is lying to me. They're just trying to keep us sick, trying to keep us unwell. And you get almost conspiratorial because you're saying, you're looking at your individual blood work and you're going, man, I'm good. You know, I'm the exact opposite of their guideline. However, like you're saying there are other things that are at play here, and it's not like, you have to look at the bigger picture, which is often very hard to do. Like, for example, again, in that cholesterol example, if you're an individual that, exercises, does like higher intensity work, does lower intensity work, is very aerobically fit, has lower levels of body fat, eats your fruit and veg, sleeps, but you don't actually manage it in terms of like actively manage it, but you are managing it anyway. You manage your blood lipids, your triglycerides, and you do all the other stuff that goes into heart disease. You do all of that other stuff right. You get enough sleep, your stress is in a good place, etc. Right? And all of a sudden you're like, oh, I don't get heart disease. I followed the exact opposite of the guidelines here, and I didn't get heart disease. So you can see why there becomes this disconnect, and it's so hard to detach from the situation and look at all the variables that are going into this. And like you're saying here, like you can look at obesity, like we're talking about in this context, and focus solely on that by moving the bell curve, or are we looking at the health negatives that are associated with that, and are there other interventions we could do to move the bell curve for that thing, again, whatever it is, heart disease, blood pressure, whatever, and do that, they then interact, have knock-on effects in other areas. And it's just so hard for the individual, like the average person, to actually see all these moving parts.
Yeah, and an example of that recently for me personally was I just had my bloods taken recently, got my blood results, and my fasting triglycerides were super low, which is like a really good thing from like an insulin sensitivity perspective, related to cardiovascular disease, but one of many markers of metabolic health. But up to that point, my appetite hadn't been fantastic, so I was actually eating more refined carbohydrates, more sugar than I normally would, because I was just trying to get my calories up. I'm an active guy, lean guy. It wasn't affecting me negatively. But that doesn't necessarily mean that would happen on a population level. On a population level, we wouldn't be saying that, a diet that is rich in refined carbohydrates and sugar is going to lead to low fasting triglycerides. And this is where where it's really important to be a scientific thinker when it comes to your own individual outcomes with your health, because this is what you see all the time, where someone switches to a vegan diet or they switch to a keto diet, carnivore diet, whatever, and they have miraculous outcomes. They're like, oh my God, it's the first time I've ever been able to stick to a diet and I got these great health outcomes. And they assume that is generalizable for the whole population. However, it's not, because if it was, then we wouldn't have all these people who are saying, hey, I tried a carnivore diet, whereas I tried a vegan diet. There's clearly some sort of individual level effect. And the role of public health is effectively to say what's likely to work for the most amount of people, rather than, taking the most extreme prescription. So that's just something to keep in mind yourself, because there's definitely examples that I've come across where, people have taken the bait as such, because one of their friends will say, that they eat as much saturated fat as they want and their cholesterol is perfectly fine, no issue. But then that individual themselves might have, really high total cholesterol, high LDL, and they're concerned about it. And they're like, well, what should I do? I've been told that this is a lie. So it is important to keep that kind of population level stuff in mind. And as it relates to obesity specifically, then you can start to think about how some of the interventions or recommendations, for example, might start to move that bell curve. An example that maybe mightn't be so intuitive all the time would be something like having streets that people can actually walk safely on, for example. That's something you wouldn't typically consider to be related to obesity. But if you were living in for example, a really rough neighborhood that you didn't feel safe walking in, there was lots of glass broken around the streets, there was very poor lighting in some areas, so you couldn't go out in the evening really.
Or you lived in Ireland, anywhere outside of Cork, Dublin, Galway, and there were no paths.
Literally, yes. I find myself in that position very often. But yeah, if you're in any of those positions, like, you're actually not able to really go for a walk anytime you want. In Ireland, for example, it's raining a lot. We can't change the weather, but it's another example.
I have a cross trainer behind me.
There you go. Everyone should get a cross trainer. but but you can start to see how these things that seem divorced from the health discussion are very much relevant to health, because if you were to improve the infrastructure within a whole neighborhood, you clean up the streets, and you've got neighborhood watch in place within the community. There's good lighting in all laneways. There's a good police service that are monitoring for any criminal behavior, etc. All those types of things can actually increase the probability that someone feels safe to go out for a walk after work in the evening or early in the morning, without any obstacles, and as a result increases activity within that area and potentially increase population health or reduce rates of obesity through increasing energy expenditure. So these are the types of things that we don't think of as personal trainers, because we're not, I don't know if you have glass in your streets. I'm just thinking, hey, can you get your 10,000 steps in? So they're the barriers that public health would often be concerned with. And that obviously is also relevant to the food supply. We've discussed previously, for example, fast food density within a given neighborhood and how that might impact behavior of wide groups of individuals. And as a result, the obesity rates within those neighborhoods or communities. You could also think about specifics within the food supply, such as, for example, the regulation of sugar content in soft drinks, as we discussed, or it could be something like, for example, a limit on calorie density in different products. This isn't something that's widely in place, but you could see how it might have an impact. For example, if you saw that a large proportion of increases in calorie intake from 2010 to 2020 came from bars of chocolate, for example. Like, that's not the case, but I'm just giving you an example. You might actually, the government or the public health officials might say, you know what, currently chocolate, the average bar of milk chocolate has a calorie density of 540 calories per 100 grams. If we could reduce that to 440 per 100 grams, that'd be a significant reduction in calorie intake and potentially lead to better outcomes at the population level. Again, it might make a difference to you because you mightn't even eat chocolate, and you might even
it might, yeah, I was going to say, it might even be a negative for you. You might be like, oh, yeah, I love this, I get my calories in this.
Not as tasty anymore.
Yeah.
But on the population level, it does actually modify behavior a bit, because it might, just lead someone to eat a little bit less. It might even change the flavor profile slightly for some people, so they don't have a tendency to consume as much. Not great for Cadbury's, but good for population health. Okay, so these are the things that we're always wrestling with, and the different types of things that can go into potentially modifying obesity rates, even though it mightn't help you as an individual.
Yeah, it's such a intuitive area once you actually start thinking about it, but it is something that most people just don't think about, because again, we get caught up in this individual argument or this individual discussion. It's like, oh, well, like if you're obese or overweight or whatever, it's just the individual decisions, it's completely the individual's fault, and it's their responsibility. And well, yeah, to an extent it is their responsibility. Like, it's hard to argue that it's completely their fault. Now, 100%, like that's on a bell curve as well. Like, there's definitely individuals out there that they actively tried to get obese, like you see videos of that stuff as well. Like they have, like, I don't know, their boyfriend or their girlfriend is like a feeder or something, so like there are situations like that. However, the vast majority of people don't want to be obese, and it's the environment that is driving them to be obese. It's the driving them to be overweight. Like you said, Gary, they might be in an area that they don't feel safe walking in. They don't feel like they could, walk home from school. They haven't got activity in since they stopped organized, activity with school since they were like, whatever, 16 or something, and all of a sudden they just haven't exercised because there's no public gym in the area. There's no, private gym in the area because, they live in a lower socioeconomic area, and, it's not economically viable for a gym to be there. And all they have around them is fast food and whatever else, so it's like there's reasons that they struggle to regulate their weight, and it's not necessarily their fault. However, like we've discussed, it is still their responsibility to look after the issue in whatever ways they can. And this is where it starts getting, the water start getting muddied, because all we can really talk about is individual interventions. Like I can be like, okay, so this is how we solve it in your case. You can buy this, and this equipment, and we can get a great workout. Oh, you don't have enough money for this. This is another option, or, oh, you can't do this. This is another option, right? Like we can come up with an intervention that gets them exercising, that gets them making better food choices, that gets them more active, effectively burning more calories, and consuming less calories. And all of a sudden we can get that individual to move in a better direction. So it's completely understandable that most individuals who talk about this stuff think about it as a completely individualistic pursuit, because like all I can do to help someone is give them individual like interventions. I can't be like, right, what you need to do is get you and 1,000, 2,000 of your friends that are also in a similar situation, and then you need to lobby government to help in your area and do whatever. Like that's not going to happen, right? So I can only give individual interventions. However, like they're only so effective on a population level. Like for example, I can only work with a certain amount of people every week, every month, whatever, in my lifetime, right? And that's going to clearly miss people, and I assume there's 300 of me, right? Like that's still probably going to miss people. Like there's whatever fucking 7, 8, 9 billion people on earth. I don't know. Like you're clearly going to miss some individuals with that perspective. And obviously then even with that, like, are we helping them pro bono? Is it for free? Like, how do I get my food then? Who's looking after me if I'm giving them this free service, So like it becomes a very hard thing to deal with overall if you do find yourself in a situation where the environment is not set up for you to be successful with your weight management goals, And ultimately what needs to happen is government intervention along with individual intervention. They should be working side by side, and the government intervention or society-wide intervention to make exercise more accessible, to make general activity more accessible in whatever form that is, and to ultimately make the food system better. We've discussed like we're not smart enough to know all the stuff. Like I like economics and all that kind of stuff, but like if you were like, oh, you go in with the fucking government there and redesign the economic policy, I'd be like, here, look, there's far smarter people to be able to do that. But at the same time, I can still recognize that there is a problem there that needs to be fixed, so that ultimately what we can do is move that bell curve to a healthier position, to get more people in the bulk of that bell curve into a healthier position, right? And yes, 100%, that is going to leave some individuals behind. And as I've said before, like we've talked about before, like we are in this area where like I don't have obesity, Gary, you don't have obesity, So like we're probably not the ones, or we're probably the ones that would get left behind with interventions. Like you're saying, like, oh, you're looking for ways to easily get calories in. If we just start getting foods that, have fewer calories, it's going to be a struggle for you to get the calories in that you need, right? But ultimately, if it leads to 30% of the population now being in a healthier BMI, like, does the government really care that you can't find enough Skittles or whatever else to, get your carbohydrates in post-workout? Like, no, they don't care about that, right? So there are obviously going to be individuals left behind with policies like this, and that is always the case. That is always the case with intervention. There are trade-offs to the intervention you make, whether it's a good intervention on a society level or a good intervention on an individual level. Like, it's still a situation of just managing trade-offs, and you're never going to get it perfectly right. Again, a good one is that saturated fat stuff. Like if you are a dairy farmer and the government says we are now limiting saturated fat, and your main source has been like, making butter, like that's how you get your income, like you are definitely going to be negatively affected, right? And it is the way it is. Now, ultimately, like I believe in jobs, as we've talked about before. I think that's the most important thing that a government can do, is stimulate the economy to make jobs. Don't care about inflation. I care about jobs and unemployment. Ultimately, those farmers that get dispossessed with that system, like they have to be financially aided in transitioning to a different thing. However, like we still have to acknowledge that a system like that, where we go, okay, saturated fat is bad, let's move away from that, that is negatively affecting some of your population, both in terms of their unique tastes, like maybe you just like butter, like, you know, that's all you eat. But also we live in a country where like there are dairy farmers that make a living from making butter, and you can't just throw them under the bus to make the population healthier overall. Now, ultimately, again, this is a scum perspective. We would just sell more butter to America, um, or some other country that didn't have these interventions to lower saturated fat intake. But ultimately, again, that's just, if we look at the population-wide, the Earth population-wide intervention, we're not really. It's just a penny in the water. Rather than fixing the world, we're just fixing like, oh, Ireland, we fixed this nutritional thing. You know, it's like it's helpful, but it's not necessarily, you know, the best we could do.
Yep, and it would be an absolute sin to not have butter available to put on a scone. You know, I mean,
Or on potatoes, man.
potatoes, brown bread, everything, delicious.
This is one of the issues. Like, why is all like good food bad for you? You know,
Not
like,
fair. There's no
like
cosmic justice.
it literally isn't though. Like it's reckless. Like I don't understand how all the good stuff, it just ends up being bad for you. Like it always amazes me that more people aren't obese or more people don't have health issues. Like the fact of the matter, like the fact that I don't just go down to the shops and buy a bag of Doritos for breakfast or lunch or whatever, and then I don't know, order a takeaway for dinner. Like that's more amazing in my mind. You know, I'm like, that's not to pat myself on the back or anything, but like, I'm like, I, I understand why I do it because I like all this health and fitness stuff. But if you're just a normal, average, everyday person that couldn't, you know, they don't care about this health and fitness stuff, like I 100% understand the perspective because man, it sounds fucking delicious to be like, yeah, I just had like really tasty stuff all day. Yeah, okay, cool. It was high in saturated fat, high in salt, high in calories, and yeah, okay, I'm carrying a little bit of extra weight. I understand why you would do it. It's fucking tasty.
Yep. That's being human, you know. It is surprising, but here we are. Both lean, absolutely shredded, out of our minds. Not quite.
Muscular beyond compare.
Not quite. But anyway, I think that's everything I wanted to cover anyway. Do you have any additional points you'd like to add in?
I have nothing else to add to that. Ultimately, I just want people to get away from this conversation that there exists a bell curve with this stuff. And if we're trying to help the most amount of people, what we ultimately want to do is move the overall bell curve. And that to do that, it's not an individual thing. Like you're not going to get individual data points that make up that bell curve and try to move them. Yes, as a personal trainer, yes, as a medical professional, etc. That's what we're going to do. However, as a society-wide plan of action, it's probably not the most effective plan of action. However, the only other action that can be done is by government. So therefore, we all have a role to play in terms of either lobbying the government, either interacting with your senators, congress people, etc., ministers, whatever it is in your country, lobbying them, telling them your beliefs, what you think needs to be done, or at least be looked into, and ultimately lobby the government so that they fix the environment we find ourselves in and stop prioritizing the profits of multinational corporations over the health of the individuals that actually live in the country. You know, in my mind, that would make sense.
Sounds good to me. And in the meantime, if you'd like to get on the path with your own individual health goals, we do have coaching spaces available. So if you'd like to, work on your training and your nutrition goals, lifestyle goals, whatever, you can work with us. We do offer nutrition only coaching as well, if that's just something you want to focus on its own. So if you're interested, there's information in the description box below, or you could message any of us on our social media. Me at Skinny Gaz on Instagram, Paddy at The Real Paddy Farrell, or Brian at Brian O'Hengasa, or of course just message the Triage Method page, and we will get back to you with further information. Along with that, you could just subscribe to our newsletter, the Triage Method newsletter, and receive some additional free information along with keeping up with all of the content that we are producing. And if you're a coach yourself, and you'd like to just do a better job at relaying on valuable information to individuals, we do also have a member site, the Coach's Corner, that you can subscribe to for supplementing your education. We have a free open access Facebook group, the Triage Method community as well. We welcome anyone asking any questions or posting problems they're having or case studies or whatever within that group. So join that if you're interested. And then other than that, we do recommend, as I said, following along with our social media, subscribe to the YouTube channel. If you're on a platform that allows it, leave a rating and review on the podcast. If not, at least share it on your social media. It's always appreciated when people share it on their Instagram stories. And it, you know, it lets more people know that we're putting out the good word of Triage. But other than that, that's everything for this week, I think. Anything to add before we finish?
No, nothing to add except I hope everyone has a phenomenal week and that they get after it.
Get after it. We'll see you next week.
Peace.